So tonight I'm going to talk about regenerative gardening. I expect you to know a lot about soil health already, but I am going to talk about it, through my different principles. I work with gardeners and farmers, so on both scales, and I use pretty much the same principles. I just scale it down when I'm working with gardeners or urban farmers, and I scale it up when I'm working with larger ag, regenerative ag. So as my dad, it's mostly how I learned gardening and prairie ecosystems. I grew up in Nebraska, and those are my kids, and that's how I'm handing down my farming and my gardening. So it's really important to me that I've learned my knowledge from a lot of elders and mentors, and that I'm handing it down. So I always like to talk about that. I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of folks to give this presentation, and I've had a lot of mentors and collaborators. This is my business partner, Paula Westmoreland. I co-own Ecological Design with her. She started it in 2000, and I came on in 2005. And we are the best of buddies. She wrote a book called This Perennial Land, about increasing third crops and our perennial crop cover. And then she also created a natural capital plant database. So if you want to look up polycultures or different kinds of companion plants, fruit guilds, that kind of thing, you can check that out. It's Permaculture Plant Data is the website. So anyway, we have this company and we do mostly design, mapping, and education. I do a lot of mapping. I walk a lot of acres every year, and a lot of that will translate into a design, into some sort of concept mapping. And I get to teach a couple times a year. So this is special for me that I get to come and talk. So thank you for having me out. I work with urban farmers and rural farmers, homesteaders. I work with a number of tribal entities, some campuses, and some community spaces. I have a significant percentage of women farmer owners that I work with as well. So my approach to land is mostly indigenous wisdom. I use a lot of observation and interaction. I experiment a lot. I've had a lot of failures, which is why I think that my knowledge feels fairly robust. I have failed a lot. And then just scientific knowledge. So I'm trained in agroecology. I'm trained in permaculture, holistic management, and we like to specialize in regenerative agriculture. So that's kind of how we operate. That might be a little bit hard to see, but essentially I think it's really important to garden for joy. So there's a lot of drudgery or trudgery that I hear from folks sometimes in the field. And so I like to kick it off with joy, like, why do you garden? And then some efficiency. So here, it might be a little hard to see, but this was for a medicinal client. She has a medicinal tinctures mostly based, but she wanted something different, so she ended up doing spirals and circles. So we had to figure out how are we going to do that more efficiently. So I say, and some efficiency, right? So they're still planted together, but they weren't in linear rows. I just always like to say, zoom out for a second and look at yourself. Why are you growing what you're growing? I know a lot of people who are just kind of well, you're supposed to grow this, or my daddy always grew this. Well, do you like it? Do you eat it? Does your family eat it? Do you like how it looks? And if not, check that and say, maybe I should try something else. Or what are my favorite foods? Am I growing those things? What are my favorite flowers? Can I grow any of those here? So just kind of look at I always say, start with your own self-assessment. And that goes with your property too. So, are you always coming in and parking in the same spot and walking to the same spot? You're going to want to make sure that you're passing things that you really love along that spot, right? Because you do it every day. Same, if you're going to the chicken coop, like what are you getting along that chicken coop that you're going to be able to come back and cook with your eggs or whatever. So I like to really think about those spaces. So assess yourself, assess your routines, think about what you like to do. So for farm scale design, we use this called scale of permanence. It's from the 1950s from an oil man in Australia, Yeoman, P.A. Yeoman, and we've adapted it basically, but it goes from the hardest things to change, like climate, over to the easier things to change, soil. Soil is considered easier to change because you could just take a dozer and move it, right? We now know, how quickly you can change the pH and the organic matter and the mineral content of soil with ruminant agriculture, right? So I don't want to put a garden in or put in some animal paddocks if I haven't figured out my water and my fencing and I've assessed my trees, right? Because those aren't going to move anytime soon if I have old trees. So we start on the left side with climate and geography, with water. What do I have going on with my water table, my type of water, what I have, understand my water, my access, do I have the right roads where they should be or my paths where they should be? And then I get into the trees and the veg and the crops and the animals. So I think about those things, like the hardest things to change, are those good? Are those, because those are expensive and you don't want to go back and fix those. You don't want to have to go back and build fences or take out fences, right? So we're thinking about the hardest things in design to the easiest things. And on the bottom, it's my economic context and my social context, so I can't also do things that aren't in my pocketbook, right? Or that I'm gonna have to budget for along the way. And then my social context, do I actually have enough manpower to do that? Is that socially relevant for me to do? Do I have the stakeholders that want to do that with me, or am I doing this by myself? So that's just a little bit about how we go about design. And then I look at where I'm growing and I think about the sectors. So the sectors are the energies moving through your farm or garden. So wind and energy and light are obvious ones. So you could take this sector compass. I know you guys, I'm 44 latitude, you're like 46, 40-ish, 46, 47. So it's pretty similar, but we got those cold winter winds, and you can align those also. We're looking at the solstices and the equinoxes. We're looking at where the sun is the largest, where our shadow is the largest, right? All the way back through to the winter solstice. So we take this sector analysis and we look at them by latitude wherever we're working. But basically, if I'm going to have these hot summer winds coming in from the southwest, I could have a fire blow through that way. So I'm going to think of crops that might have a little bit more water content. I might even have a water feature on a southwest edge of something that might have a fire danger from the hot southwest winds. So that's an example of how we would use that sector when we're looking at the map, when we're analyzing where things might come. Or the same, like if the northwest winds are going to be my coldest, hardest winds to deal with, I might put up a wind block there or a wind corner so that I could get a little season extension for my crops on that northwest side. All right, so we're thinking about sectors, and then we're thinking about zones. So look at your farm, look at your garden, look at your homestead, and the place that you visit the most frequently is your zone 1. And so zone 1 is the things that you want to get eyeballs on every day. So these are plants that maybe are a little fragile, are maybe more easily predated, or that need some extra care, or that you actually are going to eat every day. So those might be greens or berries. Those might be your culinary herbs, and maybe some of your smaller kitchen garden. Maybe it's where you want to toss your kitchen scraps. That's all kind of be in that zone 1. You don't need to put things that are lower maintenance, like your perennials or your orchard type things, in your zone 1. You can push those out a little bit. Probably, I would say, is same for like chickens and things. You can push those out a little bit, zone 2. So start to go through these zones, Zone 3 is typically more like pastures and larger orchards, more outbuildings, where you start to get some small ruminants too if you want. 4 is getting even further into like agroforestry, fruits and nuts and livestock zone. So today I'm mostly talking about zone 1 and a little zone 2. So those are things that we visit every day or that we see or pass every day. Frequent maintenance, steady yields type stuff. So I do go through there, and so I like think about everything that I might be dealing with my zone 1, and I'll read it since it might be hard to see, but you know, things that were going on in this zone 1 that I wanted to think of was like an entrance. So I wanted a pretty entrance, a welcome entrance that I was doing flowers and herbs in. I was also, you know, I'm eating and cooking, so I have an outdoor cooking space, grill space, a little solar dehydrating thing. I also had a privacy buffer because I didn't want to see this person on the north side. So I needed to grow something that was going to cover them. Relaxation, sleeping, there was like a hammock space, homestead gardens, nature play, something for some small kids and small animals. But then there was also things like the septic mound was in the zone 1. So those were all things that I was accommodating for in addition to my food gardens. So just kind of think about what that might be for you. And then it kind of goes out towards what are the functions of that thing. What's the prettiest I could make this septic mound, right? These are my main, you know, regenerative farm practices, and I basically take these to the small level on the gardening. So when we're talking about multi-species grazing, we're mostly talking about micro branching here, right? So that's how I'm kind of translating this. We're doing silvopasture and alley cropping on a very small scale, a micro scale. So in the garden, we might have our perennials on the side, and we might have an annual crop going down the middle. So we're still getting the benefits of a little bit of a microclimate, a little bit of shade, and we're getting a double harvest inside and outside. It's just on a smaller scale. So the techniques of silvopasture and alley cropping are absolutely doable on a gardening scale. Same with the buffers and the windbreaks. Every garden still benefits from having that. And it's really windy here. It's really windy where I live as well. And I think that people get worried about windbreaks and buffers because you don't want too much shade in your garden. So it's just about distance. And you could create filtered light. You know, just it depends how much wind you have. You can also just create a built infrastructure if you need to, some temporary panels. But I like a living buffer. So just a few things that I want to talk about here is like taking a bite out of your lawn. So if you do have lawn, it's worth taking a little bite out of it and changing it over to even just a seeded non-lawn species. Could be like a meadow species. And you could start to pop in some perennial vegetables. I think that's a great way to just start to decrease your lawn. These folks started doing that, and then, you know, in a few years they ended up with no lawn because they liked it, and it just kind of kept expanding. And then they came to us and said, like, oh, we want a more formal design, and we want to have a bit more production. And so, you know, we gave them a more seasonal 3 seasons garden. Let's see if there's anything in here. Yeah, their biggest concerns was creating privacy and blocking wind. So again, you can see like on the edges over here, I don't know if I have a pointer. We put a fruit, mostly a fruit tree and shrub hedge all on the sides. I love your pollinator flowering shrub over here. Hedge, that's really cool. I walked that earlier with Jaden. But some of my favorites, you know, I use aronia a lot in my designs, and not the horticultural version, and also currants. We use a lot of currants. We use more black and red currants, but we really like those on some of our edges. This is Frogtown Farm. It's like a 5-acre urban ag farm in St. Paul, Minnesota. And basically on that, what you can see is these contour lines. Those are all perennials. So aronia, asparagus, raspberries, red currants, black currants, and honeyberry are all of the contour hedges. So this is a small scale version of alley cropping. And then in between was all of their vegetable, herbs, and flower fields. And it really worked great. And then they had a hill in this circle part, so we did do more forest gardening. There's more orchard trees there. So yeah, rows of berries on contour with annuals in between is a tried and true proven thing that I really like to do. So these are a few design principles that I'll just kind of move through, but I really think the backbone of our gardens should be native perennials. These plants evolved for thousands and thousands of years with the pollinators and with the soil microbes that a lot of our like annual edibles know nothing about. So we can think about our annual edibles as kind of young, pretty young kids, and the native perennials as elders. And we want to have the whole family going on in the garden. Otherwise, it's incomplete. So that's kind of how I understand our co-evolved relationships. And it super applies to the garden. So you want to have that backbone with the native perennials. Planting in layers. I think this is important too because it also mimics the oak savanna. It mimics ecosystems that exist right now that are disappearing quickly. But we've always had kind of this layered system, and we can mimic that in the garden. We might not have the space or the ability to have maybe that tallest tree layer. You might not have space for a tall tree. So you might start at the lower tree level, like a semi-dwarf apple or cherry or plum, a semi-dwarf fruit tree, and then move down to the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer. You want the root layer in there, and you have a vining layer of some form. And ground cover. I don't think I said ground cover. That's really important. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. But it's basically, you know, stacking functions, stacking abundance. And this picture is not how I plant it exactly, because you'd never get a harvest, right? But I definitely did that when I was 20. And I was growing vines up apple trees, and I was testing all the things to see, like, well, this is how they teach it, right, in permaculture. And that's really not functional, and you don't get a lot of harvest. So we do have to spread it out. You have to have an access. You can't completely cover your tree with perennials around the edge, or else you won't be able to get to your tree. The vines actually aren't the best for the tree, so it's better to find a built infrastructure for the vine layer. So those kinds of things that you learn. So don't plant it exactly like that image, but what we're talking about is bringing in those layers in your garden so that you do have some canopy and you have a lot more biodiversity happening. So just more examples of farms. You know, we're working from low to high here. This is a YMCA children's garden. So they're working from their greens and their vegetables to their fruits, from low to high. Here we're doing a lot of like calendula, anise hyssop. We're bringing in a lot high essential oil, herbaceous perennials on the lower in front of the picture. And then like down here, and then moving into the homestead orchard, mostly semi-dwarf plums in there. But the interaction, you know, they're not right in each other, but they're close enough that we're getting the beneficial insects. We're getting the additional pollination, really high pollination, fruiting rates that we want. And then you're still getting multiple harvests and be able to stack your functions with harvest. And if you get too much, then you just mow it down, chop it down, and use it as mulch. So abundance, abundance. Plant in patches. This is another thing. One of my mentors calls it kinship gardening. I've heard it in different ways, but having patches, Another, an old version of this would also be called a milpa. But you can make use of efficient sunlight. Plants capture sunlight in different ways. So in kinship gardening, you're actually planting by family, by plant families are all together, which is a little bit unusual. But that is one traditional way to plant. Another way is in your forest gardens, where you might just have like a lot of shade and you just clear one patch for opening up. That'd be another way reason why you would have like all your perennials in there in one patch. But plants actually like to have a closer spacing, and because they have different root depths, they actually are sharing fine with the mycorrhiza in those forest gardens. So patches have been successful for me. And then plant for the future. Just, if you can't plant a legacy tree on your property, plant it on someone else's. The white pines, 250, 500 years. These are old trees. But even an oak or a hickory, we know, really gets, you want to plant something that's going to definitely outlive you. I plant food everywhere. So even in non-traditional, I'm not a traditional native planter person, and I'm not a traditional, permaculture or edible farmer either. I like to really combine them. So I'm not against adding horticultural flowers or horticultural plants or hybrids in with my natives or my edibles. I actually see that the diversity is beneficial, and I know that different microbes are serving them. So I know that I'm double, tripling also my microbes in the plant root exudates, because I'm using not just one kind of plant. But I know that is not taught in school. But you're getting different nectar, you're getting different pollen, you're getting different food for the pollinators too. So I really like adding that diversity. I also think with potential weather shifting or climate shifting, that we really have to be pushing the edges of like the colder and the hotter species that we can grow. And having those all in your garden or your yard available to you is a good thing. Planting in communities. So whenever we're designing, we're kind of taking the context of the land and then we're marrying it with our human context. So I actually work with people a lot to think about themselves and their family and what they have going on with their human context. And then that gives you what you want to do on the land, but it's not always possible. Exactly how you want it. So, but then you look at your land and like, what are you working with? What kind of soil are you working with? What kind of water are you working with? All of the context of the land. So, and then we look at those functions and those needs, and we try to marry them. So that's part of concept designs for gardens. So in those ecological functions, we're really trying to increase the soil health. We're wanting to repel pests. We're wanting to accumulate the nutrients. We're trying to clean the water. And we're trying to prevent soil erosion. So, I think that whenever we add this diversity, like think plants that have higher essential oils, that are more medicinal, that have flowers or fragrance, or they have a pest repellent, those are my general go-tos for adding any sort of diversity to my main cash crop or my main garden crop. So healthy soil means healthy food. This is actually an incredible photo. It's a little hard to see, but in the white, it lists every micronutrient and macronutrient that we find in the soil and the crust of the earth, which are the same macronutrients and the micronutrients that we find in our own bodies, human bodies, because we are earth, right? And there's little things like every single micronutrient is vital to the function of the soil. Yet mostly we only hear about NPK, right? So you don't hear that you need like molybdenum to fix nitrogen. It's a micronutrient. It's not on even most growers' soil tests. So it's actually this combination of minerals that's really important. And as we've lost so much nutrient density in our food and our seed stock over the last 70 years or so. It's this remineralization that's really important, I think, in the soil so that we can get our health back. So what this is saying is that over 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. And micronutrients is not even taught. So I think so we're not even talking about the main, you hear about calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right? The macronutrients. And that's what's in the majority of the soil tests that you'll get from your state extension tests, right? But it's really these micro ones that we're starting to learn are key to a lot of the functions. So I like to test for the micronutrients so that I get a baseline. Labs are labs. I'm not paid by anyone or use any preference for a lab, but I like looking at the main things when I tell folks to go get their soil test is that if you're starting out and you don't know a ton about your soil, just go get like a cheap $15, $20 soil test and know what your organic matter is, know what your pH is, know just sort of your basic macronutrients. That'll be on your regular soil test. And that's really good. I like to take it to the next level and do a biological testing. And this isn't something that you need to do every year at all, but it tells you who is living in your soil. And so that's fascinating to me. And often when I start with a conventional grower who has been doing a heavy amount of tillage and sprays, it's zero. It's zero. So I don't find any protozoa, nematodes, nothing. Nobody's hanging out. But it's worth that whatever $100 or whatever the test was, the biological test, to show them that their baseline was zero. Because typically within a year, folks start coming as soon as they stop their practices of tillage or overspraying. So same with the gardens. The more biology that you have in your soil, the more nutrient density you're going to have. So that healthier soil, healthier food, which means you're going to have less disease and pest attacking your food. And then just anyone living in town or anyone living in the city, anyone living in an area where you might have interstate traffic, and if you have any barns or outbuildings before 1978, which is a lot of people that I work with, you really do need to test for lead within 10 feet of those buildings. I've known a lot of people that have gotten lead poisoning. Lead, arsenic, and cadmium are almost always found in those scenarios. So please test for heavy metals if you fall under any of those categories before ever growing food in that soil. And then, yeah, Earth Fort. Earth Fort is the biological test that I like. That's Dr. Elaine Ingham's lab. And she does really amazing biological testing. The other chemical testing and physical testing, I'm not super biased on. I think it's important to just get something that will tell you kind of what are you working with. All right, so fast forwarding to waking up the soil. If your soil is, you have pristine, untouched, deep prairie soils that, occasionally get animals on it, this is not probably relevant to you. But a lot of folks aren't working with gardens with that kind of soil. So I like to remind people that you want to awaken the biology in the seeds and in the soil and in the plants. So these are all areas that we can inoculate and awaken. The biology, adding minerals, I don't think we need to get into a cycle where we're constantly adding minerals. Who could afford that, right? But I do think a lot of soils benefit from at least a start of spreading mineral. A lot of folks know, spreading lime. That's a common way to treat pH on a farm field. It's similar to that. It's similar to the same of spreading, except for we're adding more rock mineral that has been mined out and lost from the soil. So it's addressing a lot of these, broad spectrum deficiencies. I do it usually once or twice if I'm working in a new space. And I wouldn't recommend spending more money on it than that. But I do think that gets you a long ways in terms of plant health. I really appreciate inoculating seed as well. Some of you might just know that from like peas or legumes, that they come with a soil inoculant a lot when you buy them. But we can inoculate all of our seed with microbiology, either in a powder form or a liquid form. And again, if our seed is not coming from the best stock, this is a way to kind of move it along faster to health. So I think a lot of our seed needs that. But it increases germination, it increases the health. If you've ever read Fred Provenza's book, Nourishment, that's a really good example of just being able to start off life at 100%, that you're going to be a better thriver. So if you have a seed that isn't the best seed stock, going in soil that isn't the best soil, you're not going to thrive. You're probably not going to have super healthy babies, and you're probably not going to have a really super good reproduction cycle. So if we can start our babies off at the right, like 100% health, an inoculation can help ensure that. That's basically just adding microbiology, rhizobacteria's powders to the seeds. Why not? Root dips, whenever I'm planting perennials, we just planted a few hundred hazelnuts last week, hybrid hazelnuts. Always do the root dip. It's well worth the money. It's not very expensive. Mycorrhizal root dips, especially if you're going into heavily farmed fields or fields that don't have a lot of mycorrhizal fungi in them. We want to increase that fungal to bacterial ratio. And this is a really quick way to do it. You just mix it together in a trough or a 5-gallon bucket, dip your plants. You can chop up willow and put that in water too. Let that sit overnight. That's another hormone producer. So if you're planting any bare root stock, I chop up willow and put that in a bucket too, along with my root dip. And it's kind of funky, like it's a powder, and then all of a sudden it turns to a gel, and it adheres to the roots, and then you just plant it like that. It's also nice if you're going into drought soils or really dry soils. It decreases transplant shock. Compost teas. I think any sort of foliar sprays are important, but compost teas are probably some of our easiest. Compost tea, worm teas, I think are very accessible on all scales. I have a small scale worm farm in my backyard. I've also done larger. I have never seen such an experiment as this awesome worm hedgerow, I don't know which, windrow over here. If you don't know about it, check it out. But I really think that inoculating manure teas, compost teas, worm teas, anything like that is important. So it's just another level. So we've inoculated the soil, we might inoculate our seed, and then we're going to also inoculate our plants. Manure, you can just do it the dry form. The foliar sprays are more like a fertilizer, and so that can include compost tea, manure teas, a kelp tea. In the spring, we got nettles, tons of nettles. Nettles makes a great tea. Chop a bunch of nettles, put it in a 5-gallon bucket with water overnight, with the lid on. Next day, you got tea for free, right? We didn't buy anything. But we just got a lot of minerals now that we're spraying onto or pouring onto our garden. Herbal tea, fish emulsions. Those are all the kinds of teas that I like to do. This is Michael Phillips. He's an organic apple. He's no longer with us, but he's an amazing resource for growing organic fruit. And I don't really use neem oil that much anymore because it does kill all the pollinators. But if you have a super outbreak, neem is a natural herbicide. But fish hydroslate, seaweed extract, and effective microbes. And effective microbes, I'd say, is my favorite. EM1, you can buy it online. EM1 plus molasses and water is amazing. And so you should really try it. But essentially, it's increasing. It can trick pests, but it's into thinking that your fruit is more nutritious. So remember, the more nutritious and higher nutrient density your plant is, if it's at its peak nutrition, the only animal that's going to eat it is like a mammal. So no pests, things that fly, little things that fly, they actually can't digest your plant because of the nutrition, or we could think of it like the Brix. The Brix is so high that the pests will not eat it because they can't. So you can go all the way down the line, and you can actually attribute it to specific minerals that it can be tested in the tissue. But as it goes down and it decreases in nutrition, then it makes itself more available and palatable to an increased number of pests. So when we spray it with EM and molasses, we are kind of tricking it. So even if our plants aren't truly fully nutritious, the pests think that it is. And it's also giving us, fertility. So as you can see, I did hand out a garden relay because I know you can't read that. And so I just printed off some of my favorite garden relays and some of my favorite garden go-tos. In general, for veggies, if you're ever thinking like, whoa, what should I just do to add some quick diversity? Anything in the allium family, in the onion family. Marigolds are also always one of my go-tos. And I just have self-seeding nasturtiums everywhere in my garden. So all of those kind of increase my health. I always make sure I have an oregano in each of my veggie gardens too. So that's really, again, high essential oil, and I have very little pests. These are walking onions. Those are all along the base of my hoop house. Walking onions are cool, perennial onions. So polyculture, again, polycultures, guilds, we're just talking about groups of plants. We're talking about plants that like to grow with each other and that they're not competing for water, light, or resources. So it's usually 2 or more kinds of plants that like to hang out with each other, so you can increase your yield and generally just have like a more stable, resilient planting. This is a couple cherry trees with indigo, with wild indigo here. Creeping thyme and chives are on the bottom. There's some French sorrel in the back. So this is kind of a formal front yard that's 100% edible. And that was planted a long time ago, probably 10 years ago, and it's still fully going, fully producing. So that's an example of a tree guild. Woolly thyme, not creeping thyme, but it's still thyme. You can still eat it. This is an elder in a youth garden, and they went really heavy on the flowers. They had wanted some more like sensory type things than edibles. They didn't have a ton of capacity to process produce. So we did a lot of like mulches in the soils and a lot of living mulches and a lot of flowers. So it's really highly insectary. But they did have, still a good number of 4 or 5 kinds of fruit trees. So still, that's a lot. But basically, lavender and chive. So lavender is difficult, possibly for the growing season here. But if you had a warmer climate, one more warmer climate, it really it can be okay in 4B. That's kind of pushing it, so it might not be the best for you. But sage, lemon balm, any of our perennial, the anise hyssop, those are going to do the same thing that lavender would do for you, and chives. Season extension. So I really have shifted over more to using this than I did in the early years. So having a hoop house has been a game changer for me. I've switched out a lot of crops in that. There is a lot of cost shares for high tunnels if you have a space for it. And then using hoops is also been really great for if there was a heavy pest season. So you can put remay over your hoops just by like conduit and put that over your beds. You can do it in the ground or if you have raised beds. But then instead of remay for potential pests, you can also use plastic, and that gives you a few more extra weeks of growing season or ripening if you want to on particularly peppers, or if you have a late term tomatoes that are still going. And then cold frames, that one on the bottom is surrounded by straw bales, so it costs little to nothing for them. But you can use it we've done it with old window frames, reused, lots of reused materials you can do for cold frames. And that helps you if you want to start your kitchen garden or your cutting garden earlier in the spring. It's really nice to have a little cold frame. Put it on the south side of your house and get started earlier. I just want to touch on cover crops because I think sometimes people don't realize you can use cover crops on a small scale. And especially if you're using annual cover crops, all you have to do is mow them or scythe them to terminate them. So, I think that's really worth trying and looking at. Even peas or oats are, easy ones to start with. Rye is kind of another go-to, I think, cover crop that I really like. I would echo again, if you haven't walked through the hoop house, there's a cool little rye experiment where they left it and they just dug a furrow and replanted some, chard or greens in that line. So you can direct plant into your cover crop afterwards. So I think that is a good goal for folks. There's perennial and there's annual cover crops, so just be aware of what you're planting, because you could go on there and get Italian rye and have like a perennial rye and not know it, or if you wanted an annual rye and not know it. So just kind of look that up. There's great cover crop calculators for free online, so if you want to look at the dates, that's very important. That's the key to understanding cover crops, because you want to be able to get it established before winter, or if you want like a quick buckwheat in between, then you got 30 days. You got a really quick buckwheat. I like to use that a lot in between crops. But again, I really like it because I can terminate it just by mowing it or scything it. There's no tillage involved. I don't have to do, but you can smother things. That's another strategy for gardening for cover crops. All right, so I'm going to shift over to some orchard strategies. This is a larger scale orchard, but again, the same strategies are applicable to our homestead orchards. So things that I like to see are getting our small fruits in there, so raspberry, blueberry, strawberry. And then we always want to have our regular fruit trees. That's the semi-dwarves. That's that second shrub layer. I like having a woodlot, so that kind of goes back to like the legacy tree piece. Growing some sort of tree just for the carbon or just for its legacy, I think, is important. Having pollinator plantings and windbreaks are other aspects that should be included in your homestead design. And then trellis and hoop house are pretty important either for season extension or just being able to use more vertical space. Especially if you have a smaller garden, we definitely want to be using structures to go up and catch more sunlight, so we can have higher density spacing. This is Sichangu Co. They're a Lakota on Rosebud near Mission, South Dakota. They have indigenous farm, and they have a small orchard that's getting planted out. So this is a big hill. It goes big, it's a tall hill on this left side of the screen. It kind of goes down to the low, and this is the flat on this side. So they're growing, about an acre of vegetable alley cropping design in the middle. But along this hill is the orchard. So we're trying out a few kind of pears. Grow pears for your heirs. Pears are important, and I feel like people don't grow pears anymore. So really like pears. about 5 varieties of apples. So, not just one kind and not just the latest hybrid from the U of M, right? We want to get some heritage apples in there. And then plums, and then some experimental hardy apricot and hardy peach. And then the small fruits. The small fruits down here, which are really hard to read, are blackberry, late raspberry, early red raspberry, yellow raspberry, black currant, and red currant, and some cherry. We have buffalo berry, Siberian pea shrub, and some mulberry up there as their windbreak. So a few more things to keep in mind for those homestead orchards is balancing diversity and scale. Some of the most successful orchards we had for folks was where they did a small scale, high diversity tree planting, and they saw what did best and what they liked the most, and they took that and planted it out on scale. And I think that's really important. And the small scale, diverse space became their nursery. So I think that's a really good strategy. Diversity in the right place. This is Meskwaki down in Iowa. They have a indigenous farm and farm company. This was when they were first starting their orchard. Someone else had come in and put in, they wanted a really diverse orchard, and they did a different tree. Every 2 trees was a different species, and it was a nightmare for harvest. It looked kind of cool, but then as soon as it started growing out and got older, it was totally unmanageable. So diversity in the right place. You want, I think you want your main row, all the same species in one row. And if you want diversity, then switch it up in your rows, right? Or switch it up and get your diversity in your ground cover. Or switch it up and get your diversity in your perimeter edge row, hedge row on those edges. Nurse crops and edge species. This was, we put hazelnuts and aronia out in an open field. Maybe it was like a half acre of fruit and nut nursery that they wanted to start. And it just desiccated the roots of the plants immediately, and they just had nothing there, because they were going into this tilled bare soil with no windbreak and no ground cover, so and no irrigation. So it was a really tough start for those babies. So just getting any sort of quick growing nurse crop. Phacelia is what that purple flower is. Phacelia is a really high producing pollinator plant, but it's a really quick ground cover. It's a really quick cover crop that we like to use. There's sunflower and buckwheat and one other thing in there, I don't know. But anyway, that really helped as soon as we got our cover crop in there. And then we did some hybrid poplars really quick to get some quick windbreak coverage and catch some spray that's coming in from the neighbors. The dreaded spotted winged Drosophila fly, I'm just going to mention this. SWD is coming and is kind of an increasing problem for soft fruits. Some of my favorite soft fruits are raspberries and honeyberries. Strawberries, I like them too, but raspberries and honeyberries are really my fave. And they don't have a very tough exterior. So we really have to experiment more with finding those super early season berries. And then also trying to do a late season. The other strategies for SWD would be covering them with remate or like a screen. And then you can also spray them with like essential oil spray. So Dr. Bronner's soap, like Dr. Bronner's Peppermint Castile soap, do like a 1-to-4, 1-to-5 water down and spray those on your plants. That works for aphids too. So exclusion netting and then spraying are my solutions for soft fruits. So while you're at it, throw some King Stropharia in your mulch, in your wood mulch. So I'm all about adding functions. We already know that in your orchards you need a lot of wood. Mycelia is nature's internet, right? This is how plants are sharing resources. They're talking to each other. They're saying, what's up? What's coming down the line? Here, do you need something? So we want to increase the mycelia talking to each other. King Stropharia in like a sawdust spawn, throwing that into your ramial wood mulch is just a really quick way. And then you can eat it, the wine caps. So your woody plants will thank you for that. And then just a quick little highlight of elderberry. Elderberry is one of my favorites to add to orchards. So this is a 100-acre regenerative farm in Wisconsin called Lily Springs. And we did a lot of elderberry here. The elder is kind of like the people's medicine cabinet because it's free. And you can cut it and give it to your neighbors or your friends and family, and it's really easy. You can harvest the flowers. You can eat the berries. Trying to think what I want to say about this. Yeah, basically the hardwood cuttings are really easy. You just take like a 45 angle cut at the bottom of the plants. Make sure you have a couple nodes. Stick it in the ground. You could add that willow water, I was chopping up the willow and putting in the water. You could add some pour that over the sticks in the ground, but it's really easy. And I think it's just, they're cold hardy. You can make jams, jellies, wines. They're good for your immune system. You can make cough syrup. They're just on and on and on. There's so many things. So I think elderberry is really worth sticking in your garden somewhere. I think it's worth having a little nursery or a little patch of elderberry. That's what the flower looks like. I do hedgerows of elderberry. I like elderberry as a hedgerow. All right, a quick note on forest farming, forest gardening. If some of you have shady patches of land, you still can produce things. So mushrooms is an obvious one to me to produce in a forest garden, but gooseberries, ginseng takes longer. That one takes more like 7 years. Are easier ones that I've had. Wild ginger is another good one. So growing things in the shade is possible. And then every orchard and garden should have pollinator plants. So whether that's a strip, whether that's an island, whether that's just like a front entrance, we all really, and that goes back to like our native pollinator, our native perennial plantings, having that elder in the garden is really important. This is comfrey, it's not native, but that's an apiary, and the amount of bees and production that comes off of just the comfrey is incredible. 70 plus, at least 70% of our crops are indirectly reliant on pollination, and 30 to 40% are directly related to pollination. I mean, it's really crazy with how many bees are decreasing, and so we all need to make sure that we're adding it. I add pollinator strips between any of my annual crops, so even if you aren't doing the alley cropping with the perennial annual rows, you can just do a pollinator strip in between your annual row. So that's a really easy way to get in more pollinators. This picture down here is a way of using pollinators as a first succession. So it was hard ground, bad ground. They didn't know what to do with it. Young farmers. And so we just seeded it in cheap annual flower mix. They ended up being able to cut those flowers and sell those at their market in addition to their crop. But it also broke up the root compaction, and it was a great early succession strategy, but it was a pollinator planting. The CP42 is the traditional pollinator seed. It can be like $900 an acre or something. It's really expensive. You could get it cost shared by NRCS, but it's really because it has a lot of the high value grasses and flowers, forbs. So, that's what we just want to think about is habitat, pollen, and nectar when we're thinking about the pollinator planting. So yes, I love CP42, but we don't have to do that. We can make a huge amount of difference with pollinators in our area. Some of the urban Twin Cities folks that I work with, there's not even a crabapple tree within their 5 blocks that they exist. You know, crabapple is the universal pollinator, so you want a crabapple for whatever varieties of apples that might need pollinating. And sometimes you'll find blocks with no universal pollinators. So it's just really important for all of us to kind of make that contribution. It wouldn't be regenerative gardening if I didn't talk specifically about the animals and not just the microbes. So in gardening, I think chickens, rabbits, worms, and bees are really important. Here, you know, I was working with a group of college students, and he had finished his design here, and right here it says rabbits, chickens, and doggy in the middle, and all of the production is around the outside. So, you know, in this situation, he was prioritizing his animals, and in general, in my experience, even though I do have some free-ranging chickens, but it's really hard to protect your food plants from the animals. So I have to use a lot of exclusion fencing or wire around especially young plants, or else they'll get scratched out by the chickens. And it's kind of a myth because lots of people like to talk about growing all these perennials with their chickens, and you know, their elderberry is like this tall after 3 years, you know? So you really need to use exclusion fencing for any of that. And then the rabbits, you know, I've done rabbit tractors and chicken tractors on a small scale suburban lot. It was a 3-acre suburban lot. And I did those tractors and I moved them around. Worked fine. Rabbit poop is excellent. So if you're into rabbits, or if you're into weaving, you know, Angora rabbits are a great choice for gardeners. They're really gentle. And then the worms, you know, red wiggler worms, they're just pretty easy to deal with. And they also solve your indoor composting problems in the winter. So you can just bring your box in the winter and you can still compost through the winter instead of getting just this big mound of frozen whatever or throwing away your food scraps. And up there, you know, is more of a larger mobile tractor situation. But yeah, the exclusion, I've killed a lot of plants with animals. Bees, I don't know, maybe you're there. Maybe you're ready to take the leap into becoming a beekeeper. I think it's awesome. If not, invite one to come closer to you. So finding old beekeepers is really one of my strategies. It's like, feels like a needle in a haystack these days. But finding an old beekeeper is just a wealth of knowledge and really important to either learn that or share that out further, and then share out their, you know, I'll plant for you. Can you bring a hive here? So we're starting to see a lot of gardener networks start to make alliances with beekeepers, and I think that that's really important. So lastly is my case study on Tiny Diner. This was an old gas station. It was polluted, it was compacted, it was covered by concrete, and the new person took it over and turned it into a small restaurant. And we were able to do the landscape design here, and she wanted mostly edibles. So she had a large solar array that went over the patio. And then we basically had to do, because a lot of the things were the soil was contaminated, we just have to grow up. So you just have to go in raised boxes, you have to grow in raised beds. And because it was very tiny patch, we had to use all of our vertical layers really extremely. Also, water flow was a really difficult situation, so we even had like little aqueducts that would have to go over hardscapes to move our water that was coming off of the roof. We had rain chains coming down that would then go into drain tiles into gardens. So we really had to super think how we were going to get water off our roofs and hardscapes. Because, yeah, water was a big issue. And then we just used a lot of herbs and flowers. The vegetable production was mostly happening at a farm a little further off that it was sourced for, so we didn't have a huge pressure on vegetable production. But yeah, having that many pollinators with folks dining on a patio sometimes caused some anxiety for the diners. So we do have to think through, like, where do you want your pollinators, right? Visiting. Here you can see, again, like just really nonconformist. Like I still demanded that I would have a legacy tree, even though we had this tiny little patch. So we chose a smaller pine, but we still wanted to have all of the different layers. And then here we're growing, espalier trees. So training those trees. These were bought as 2-year-old trees, so their bottom 2 branches were already trained. But just being able to get more space. Otherwise, you really wouldn't have space for a fruit tree in that small of a garden. So if you have a really tiny garden, consider laying your fruit tree flat against a wall and running some wire against your wall, or having a fence with some wire, and then you can get enough light between those branches that it will produce fruit. All right, and then lastly is like some whimsy. So I think whimsy in garden is great, and I also think respite in garden is great. So do you have a place to rest in your garden? Do you have a place that is shady in your garden? I think that's important. This is a willow dogwood thicket. You can't really tell, but it's a woven thicket. And there's just flowers and vines growing up on the outside. But in the winter, it's still a structure. So just thinking about, do you have any structure in your garden that you like to be in? And that's it. I hope I inoculated you and inspired you for your garden this coming year.